And so you see very different population-wide infection fatality rates. And so if we applied those to the Republic of Ireland, depending on whether you are very rigorous and only consider, confirmed COVID cases as COVID-related deaths. So the top figures are those that were PCR confirmed. The bottom figures are the ones that are probably COVID based on symptomological classification. And so if you, depending on whether you take the inclusive definition of a COVID death or the more rigorous definition of a COVID death, and whether you were to assume a very young population like Manaus or an older population like Sao Paulo, you do get estimates of full pandemic fatalities ranging from about 8,000 to 35,000. Now, Sao Paulo is probably a lot more comparable with Ireland than Manaus would be. So we could expect something in the range of the figures on the right, somewhere between 20 and 30 or 40,000 fatalities. Now, of course, those are just ballpark figures, but it does give you some idea of the kind of scale we would be dealing with if we were to take the path to herd immunity. Okay, and then fatalities are very obvious outcome, but I think we're all becoming more conscious of long COVID. And I've chosen this example because I know Paul. He's a colleague of mine from Liverpool where I worked, and was always an energetic, such a pleasant, energetic, positive gentleman. And if you see some of his more recent, very short videos, he's really struggling with long COVID after 6 months. And as he says in his blog, he's not sure if he's ever going to work again. And that he also said, as one of the great gurus and founders of evidence-based medicine, that right at the moment, evidence-based medicine isn't much use to him. And so I think we all need to be mindful of this phenomenon, the fact that we don't fully understand it, and we don't have a quantitative handle on it yet, particularly as long COVID victims tend to be quite quiet. They don't feature on the radar as much as say, some of our noisier population groups. So if herd immunity doesn't appeal to you as a control strategy and you'd prefer to go for elimination, then you come down to, or even just talk about flattening the curve, whether you want to flatten it or whether you crush it. The first stage is getting your epidemic to shrink. And so these are curves from the United Kingdom showing that, even though the UK didn't get everything right, they were enormously successful in reducing transmission of COVID and managed to start shrinking their epidemic. And if we go to the folks who really did it best, did it earliest, and came out the other side fastest, then we look at China, and these are the curves from Wuhan. As you can see, it was done in phases, and that they learned as they went along. There were some mistakes, which did result in some minor resurgences. But by the time they started to get the hang of it, as you can see on the right-hand side, they really got contraction rates of about 50% every 2 weeks. So that's what an R of 0.5 translates into. And then once they really got into the end stages, they were able to tighten down again until, basically their epidemic was shrinking to a third of its size every 2 weeks. Now, the good news is we more or less matched that. So, with really a set of approaches that were not as stringent and didn't in any way, interrupt our democracy or our freedoms or any way, we also managed to get down to reproductive numbers of a half, which is basically an epidemic that halves in size every 2 weeks. And the thing that breaks my heart is that we came so close to that endpoint, the endpoint of zero COVID. Donegal had no cases for a couple of weeks in a row. By my calculations, Cork County was about 6 weeks away from 0 cases per day, and Dublin would have been 8 to 10 weeks. So we were doing really well until the end of June. And here's some great graphs of the actual data from Ireland and some fitted transmission models, but courtesy of Paul Dempsey, who you should really get on for another talk specifically on this subject. And you can see there where we got ahead, we rushed phase 2, we got ahead ourselves a little bit with anticipatory behaviors. And so we're not sure about how well phase 2 worked, but we do know that phase 1 managed to maintain all the full effects of our original stay-at-home order. But since then, since really the end of phase 2, we've been in rock steady exponential growth up to the point where we find ourselves today. The good news is we can still turn this around. While phase 1 wouldn't get us to an elimination point by Christmas, it would get us below 10 cases a day in the same way that Victoria did. Our current position is very similar to the one Victoria was in 2 months ago. And while phase 1 level restrictions would not give us a COVID-free Christmas, it would at least give us an excuse to have a lot of optimism looking forward and to be able to see some light at the end of the tunnel, for an end to this whole business. And then, that was phase 1 as we knew it then. Of course, the world has moved on. We know a lot more now. New technologies are coming online, national capacity is improving. And so if we could suit things up, and this is an example, one that Paul has simulated, in which he assumed that essential workers were tested approximately once a week. And that, of course, accelerates your progress so that we could be down to, about 0 cases per day, maybe 1 or 2 by Christmas. And once you get down to 0, then you begin the standard countdown that is part of elimination protocols. Okay. Now, life would go back to normal, and there are very few things that would be different. One of those things is international travel. And I just want to make the point here that this is really the first fire alarm bell ringing from China back on January 31st. They were able to really measure the rates of movement of COVID around China and out of China, coming from Wuhan, and really gave us a very clear warning. Here it comes, watch out. And some countries like Australia, they took the warning early. New Zealand took the warning early. Taiwan responded fast. And these are some of the things we're going to have to deal with if we want to be able to sustain a zero COVID status. But it looks to me like something that's worth pursuing. This is Wuhan, where it all started. And it looks like fun to me. I'm a bit old for this kind of thing nowadays, but I think for young folks, this looks like a situation worth pursuing. So those are 2 different roads going in very different directions. Herd immunity, which isn't really a strategy, it's more of an acceptance. And then elimination, which is really a strategy and a tough one. But elimination is also, it's a standard play in the global public health playbook. Now, what we're currently bought into as a country has been described in different ways. Living with the virus, flattening the curve, and flattening the curve in particular is a bit of a misnomer. And so I'd just like to show people, these are some of the most authoritative simulations to date. These come from April, and it shows that it captures the fact that, well, flattened curves, they're not flat. Epidemics are naturally volatile entities. They curve up or they curve down, but they certainly don't lie flat. So if you do want to keep them suppressed but not eliminated, and you want to make sure that they don't overwhelm hospital capacity, then it's not really a steady state. It's not this steady, stable equilibrium. It's more like a roller coaster of restrictions that have to be applied, then relaxed, then applied, then relaxed. And so it turns into a roller coaster of epidemic waves. Now, these simulations were designed to explore the consequences of choosing such a strategy. And these authors concluded that with existing ICU capacity in the United States, which is 3 times higher than here in Ireland per head of population, for them to run through all the epidemic waves while keeping ICUs deliberately as full as they can without being overwhelmed, so that as many people get immunity as fast as possible without totally overwhelming the system, that would take 4 years. If the United States were to double its ICU capacity, build container cities or tent cities of ICUs, then it would take a minimum of 2 years. And that's to achieve a very optimistic herd immunity threshold of about 50% exposure, which I think has been very optimistic. So, and then, we have similar simulations here for Ireland. This comes from Philip Hovel's group in Cork, and you can see that, the big question I think we all have to face today is not whether we're going into level 5 restrictions, but rather, what do we do when they start working? In a month from now, when they start working, what do we do? Do we take our foot off the gas and come back to the same point a little further down the line, or do we take it all the way through to completion? Because if you do buy into a living with the virus strategy, then that's what it looks like, and what we're experiencing in present is probably fairly representative of what life will be like for all of us. And particularly of small businesses and the struggles they will go through with uncertainty, planning, maintaining customer confidence, and then of course the effect that this is having on all of us. And I think I found it very instructive that Philip's maps, which were published back in June, they do highlight Donegal as a hotspot, when most of us wouldn't have guessed that. So I just want to highlight that these things are predictable to a large extent. You can never be exact, but there are some things that we've known since the 1980s. Some of this science goes back to the turn of the previous century. And there are some things that we can predict fairly reliably, and a roller coaster ride is one of those things. Now, there's downsides to having such a high reproductive number. If you start with a reproductive number of 4, that makes it 3 times more transmissible than the flu. And what the downside of that is, it takes an awful lot of work to get below a reproductive number of 1 so that you have your epidemic contained. The upside of that is that by the time you're there, even the smallest improvements in control level give you massive improvements in your trajectory. So you really accelerate the disappearance of your epidemic very, very fast. So I think it's a bit like, if you're the amount of effort it takes to keep COVID contained means that it doesn't take much more to decide to get rid of the thing and chase it out of town altogether. And most people are very familiar with exponential growth. However, the rules of exponential decay are less obvious to most people. One of those rules is that when exponential decay occurs slowly, it occurs very slowly. So small differences, just taking your foot off the gas just a little bit more can really, really slow down progress towards elimination. So it's one of those things, you've got to really go for it. And it's more a case of accelerating into the finish line rather than easing up. Now, those are the 3 options. And the point I'd like to make about living with the virus or flattening the curve is that it's herd immunity light. It's the slow road to herd immunity. The whole idea is to just get there without overwhelming hospitals, to do it at a rate that is less traumatic. But those are, to a certain extent, those are deaths averted rather than lives saved. And, the downside of slowing anything down is it just takes an awfully long time. And while many of us have pinned our hopes on a vaccine, there's no guarantee of that. And there are many diseases on this planet for which there are no vaccines. And that's not from want of investment or effort. HIV is one, malaria is one. And so if we take the herd immunity route, the long way or the slow way, we have to consider, what will that endpoint look like? Because herd immunity doesn't stop epidemics, it just slows them down. So eventually everybody gets infected. And I'd like to show people just some examples of what that might look like from what we know about endemic disease today. So here's, this is the first photograph I took on my first job in Africa. And it captures so many things about malaria. So the first thing you should know is that all these wonderful, enthusiastic little people, most of them are actually carrying around malaria. So if you take a drop of blood, you look at it under a blood slide, most of those kids will have some malaria parasites floating around in there. They look very happy, but once you actually examine their school performance and a whole bunch of indicators of health and progress, what you find is that that everything in their lives is related to their malaria status and the parasite loads that they're carrying around. What's also missing from this picture is about 2 or 3 children. So in most African primary school classes, until very recently, for all the kids that were there would normally be 1 or 2 or 3 kids that just didn't make it. By the age of 5, they had what we would call herd immunity in the COVID context. But to earn that immunity, some of those kids, they just didn't make it. Now, so that's malaria, and that's an example of a disease that has a very stable endemic endpoint. So it's not so volatile. All these kids have immunity. I've acquired immunity to malaria myself. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. It wouldn't be a lifestyle choice, and that's stable endemism. But I think one of the points I'd like to make is that stable endemism isn't such a happy picture. So this is the footprint that malaria has left on the human genome, and basically you can explain the distribution of lots of genetic abnormalities that are related to protection from malaria based on the historical patterns of malaria distribution and historical movements of people. And a lot of this cannot be explained by fatalities alone. It can only be explained if you allow for the morbidities, all the way it slows down your life and kind of makes life pretty difficult. And so if we look at other diseases, for example, the most recent one that has gone endemic is ZIKA. It's been endemic in Africa for many years, but it was new to the American continent and for many other parts of the world. And so we had a spectacular global pandemic. I found myself involved in this one, and it just swept through the Americas. And some people have told me, well, this is an example of herd immunity kicking in and it's gone. Well, it has gone for now, but it's going to be back. And because it induces long-lasting immunity, we think that it's going to come back and hit us hard again in somewhere like 25 to 30 years. And might sound like science fiction, but one point I'd like to make is that COVID really reminds me of ZIKA, because ZIKA was a silent pandemic. Unless it really reached out and touched you and affected you directly, then you wouldn't notice. Most people who had ZIKA never noticed it. Maybe they had a rash, maybe they felt a small headache. But for the people who really were affected, the vulnerable folks, that pandemic is not over. And ZIKA is not alone in that. We have diseases like chikungunya that sweep through the tropics, predictably every 40 to 50 years as immunity fades. Friends of mine have been through these epidemics, and they say you can actually see them because everybody gets arthritis at more or less the same time. So everybody walks funny for a few months. And a lot of people are left with lasting heart problems. But a less extreme version where that immunity doesn't last so long and the epidemics sweep back every few years, so it goes through cycles, of a few years apart, then it starts to look like this. So this is dengue. This is a dengue outbreak, and these are people. This is what an overwhelmed hospital looks like, with people piled up out on the street. Fortunately, these folks are being cared for. They've got their drips. They're getting some care, but you know, this happens all the time. It just doesn't happen in Ireland. And these things are real. They really do affect other people. And it's hard to know what the end stages of COVID are going to look like if it becomes endemic. And I use this slide a lot because it's a great one for getting across the fact that when a new pathogen emerges, it's really hard to predict what it's going to look like and what it might do. And the reason I picked HIV is a couple of reasons. The first one is it's the first pandemic I actually experienced face to face. When I started working in Western Kenya, if I met 3 people and I shook hands with everybody, you know, one of those people on average would have had HIV. And, you know, back in those days, there were no drugs. So, you know, many of those friends of mine, they were gone in 2 to 3 years. And that's where I really think that this term living with the virus is totally inappropriate. It's normally a term that we use for people. So somebody today who has HIV and can access antiretroviral drugs, they're living with the virus. You know, that's what that term relates to. And then the other thing about HIV is that it's the biology of HIV sounds like science fiction, but it isn't. It's hard to believe that a pathogen can actually do this, but it does. So if you see how HIV knocks out your immune system and then kills you slowly to maximize its transmission, it really sounds like science fiction. And it's hard to believe that it happened once. But I think the key thing that we need to all be mindful of as we tackle COVID is that once these things happen once, they have a habit of happening again. So what a lot of people aren't aware of is that there's 3 different HIV virus lineages, and they all emerge separately from separate groups of primates. And all those viruses had been out there in the jungle for hundreds of years. For hundreds of years, they've been infecting individual humans. But human-to-human transmission only happened sometime in the sometime in the 1980s or so. But I think we have to all learn from the fact that once it happened once, it then happened 2 times after that. So, you know, COVID is not our last pandemic. I don't know when the next big one is going to come. It might come in my lifetime. It will certainly come in my children's lifetime. So the choices we make today in relation to COVID, they don't just affect us. They also affect the world that our kids are going to inherit. So those strategic choices, I guess, they're of huge importance to all of us. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm just wondering, is Sam with us, Aoife?
Yes, yeah, he's been here for a while.
Sorry, Sam.
That's okay.
Maybe you can close your slides there, Gerry.
Sure.
Yeah, so thanks very much for that, Gerry. There was tons of information there, and in fact, some people have commented on it. You know, there's so much, but we are recording this, and we will be sharing this, and people can then maybe digest it more slowly as well at their discretion. But I think one important idea that's there is that the effort to get down to where we were in the middle of the summer is the big part of the effort, and it's just a bit more to get all the way. I think that's actually very encouraging for me, because I, like other people, don't really enjoy yo-yoing back and forth into lockdowns. I see, so Sam McConkey is here, and I'd like to invite Sam to talk now, and then afterwards we'll have some questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, they can type it into the chat box rather than have people turning on their microphones. I think that gets a bit messy. And I have a couple of questions that have come in by email. So if you want to enter your questions in the chat box, that's the best way. And I'll put the questions to Sam and Gerry after Sam's presentation.
Thank you, Aoife. Thanks for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to try and keep fairly brief, because I feel having an interactive question and answers will also help. I suppose to start, I have really pointed out 6-8 weeks ago that our rates of COVID-19 and all that comes with it are rising in an ongoing way. And unfortunately, that has continued into the last 2-3 weeks, despite escalating restrictions, which really leads me to believe that we absolutely need to do something quite significant at this point to stop that continuing, because if it continues, then it will just get worse and worse. And we are seeing, unfortunately, people in hospitals and ICU, and many of them are elderly. So this idea that you can shield the elderly, unfortunately, in practice isn't really possible. In talking a lot about economic impact, and I'm certainly not an economist, unfortunately, my view, which maybe is the pessimistic one, is that the economic impact of COVID, no matter which way we sort of choose, either to try for a short period of time, for a few months, to restrict it and stop it spreading in our community aggressively, that will certainly have a significant economic impact. But what I would like to say is that if you let it spread rampantly through our community, that will also have at least as big and a very significant economic impact as well, as happened in, you know, New York and Milan and Bergamo and Wuhan. Because people get sick, their contacts stay at home, and then those in essential services, you know, like ESB or whatever, aren't able to go to work because of them being sick themselves, or contacts being sick, and people get afraid, demand drops. If there's a lot of people getting ill, there's likely to be, you know, fear of spending money, and then the domestic economy stops. Unfortunately, no matter what we do, our main trading partner, obviously Britain next door, has suffered a huge economic recession in the last this year, so they won't be able to pay us a lot of money for our products, and that's going to be unfortunately, over the next 6-12 months, our economy is going to suffer, because our exports, which we depend on, are going to countries that have suffered economically as well. So I feel the Irish economy, certain sectors of it have been doing relatively well and will continue to do well. As we're all over Zoom now, IT, software, hardware is doing very well in this pandemic. Similarly, the food industry, the agriculture industry is keeping going and selling. Similarly, pharma, the drugs and pharmaceuticals are going. Similarly, the banks, the financial services, the fund management, the insurance, these industries, which, you know, in Ireland there's a big financial service center, are actually still functioning. The big impact is completely different, are things like cruise ships and airlines and aircraft leasing and hotels in Dublin, and tourist industry that was dependent on incoming tourism has really been destroyed completely since you know, March. So what we see is this very divisive pandemic, a pandemic that's regressive. People with poor-paying jobs are losing them. People who are already vulnerable are being attacked, both financially and health-wise, even more so. So we've got an intrinsically regressive problem here, which means, in my view, that we need our state and our community solidarity to actually look after the vulnerable, look after the weak in a very deliberate and protected way, financially and socially. And basic services are sort of guaranteed to people who are struggling through this. My last point is really that I strongly believe that this can be controlled. There are many Eastern Asian countries that have already done that, and sometimes in the narrative in Ireland, people aren't fully absorbing that very, very large parts of the world, over 1 billion people have already controlled this. Ger showed you the slide of people having a pool party. I'm not sure a pool party is my idea of heaven, but you got the right idea. At least people are out there physically intimate and socializing, and, you know, we could all choose how we want to do it. I would come up with probably something different. But this is really important, that over 1 billion of the 8 billion of us are living in places like Perth, like Sydney, and many other cities where really COVID is, I won't say zero cases in their statistics, because there's still people coming into the country who are in quarantine, and some of them coming from Russia into China or from UK into New Zealand have COVID, and then they're developing it and showing up as small numbers of cases. But those countries have been able to control the spread, the secondary spread. So it's like lighting a match that doesn't light a wildfire. You still have a little match being struck, and we have to develop the public health capacity to identify those cases early, keep them in quarantine, effective quarantine with effective testing and effective control of small outbreaks that might occur. I'm confident that we can do that, because more than 1 billion people in the earth have already done it. Most specifically, Australia's 5 times bigger population than us, and it's, you know, people are socially quite similar to us. It's a lot of them are our relatives, and probably people in our community who were deported hundreds of years ago from stealing a sheep. So a lot of them we're related to, and we have the same relaxed attitude to life, if you like, but they have actually succeeded dramatically from August, September to now. So if Australia and New Zealand could do it, and many other democratic countries, as well as the authoritarian ones in Asia, this is possible. Within Europe, we're quite unique because we are a relatively small island. We are socially cohesive. So we're actually more likely to succeed first rather than other EU countries. So I believe, just like in the, you know, the plastic bag tax or the smoking ban, Ireland can take a lead role in this and say, this is what we want to do in public policy. And I strongly feel the leaders in Northern Ireland will go along with this, because they're seeing horrendous problems, you know, in Strabane and Derry. Scotland also are really seriously considering this zero COVID. And of course, there is an all-party group in Westminster that are advocating a strong control as well. And in many parts of England, it's been quite well controlled. So I feel this uniqueness of being an island is actually to our advantage, rather than being somewhere like Luxembourg. The downsides are that this would involve relatively strict control of incoming travel. That means that the airline industry and the tourist industry will really not like it, and there's really no way around that. That's an essential component for this to succeed. But hopefully, as other countries like Britain succeed as well, and perhaps some of the other island nations in Europe succeed. I've already mentioned Greenland and Faroes, who have succeeded. Now, I know we don't go to Greenland and Faroes on our holidays, and probably none of you are thinking to, but I'm just putting it out as a model. If that can work in Greenland and Faroes, it can work on Tenerife, perhaps Corfu, and so on. So this strategy can spread and grow. So we clearly need to support those failing industries. It's not right or fair or helpful that the people who work in the airline industry are sort of destitute, while others of us, while maybe overworked, are still, you know, comfortable in secure jobs. There will inevitably have to be, you know, public sector cutbacks at some stage, because our economy is inevitably going to, you know, to take a significant hit on our income. So I think all of our security is going to decrease, but we really need to support those who are most impacted. So that's really all the points I wanted to make. I'm happy to stop and take questions.
Thanks, Sam. That's great. And even in terms of the economic impacts, I think it was somebody else said earlier today that you know, you have vulnerable groups health-wise, and you've got vulnerable groups economy-wise, and we should be protecting both of them. But it's what needs to be done in order to get through this. So there's some questions here in the chat, and I'm just going to read them out, and perhaps Sam and Gerry can decide who'd like to answer them. But the first one is, if you've considered the work by Larimer et al., that rapid frequent testing using any number of the methodologies, antigen, CRISPR, Cas, LAMP, can play a very important part in managing COVID without lockdown. So Sam, you just muted yourself. Are you? Oh, Gerry wants to answer.
Well, Gerry was indicating he wanted to speak.
Oh, great.
Go ahead, Gerry.
Sorry. Go ahead, Gerry, please.
Yeah, so I've been involved in large-scale population-wide screening, and by large-scale I mean, say, a couple of Zambian districts, but probably the same size as an Irish province. And I'd have to just say that it's the logistic practicalities of doing these things across entire populations that are really tricky. And then the other thing is, you know, we all get tired of participating in these things. You know, we became very conscious of it in our household because we had to test the kids. So we had, like, there's great little point of care tests for malaria. You know, we have them in the fridge downstairs in the house. But, you know, the kids learn to hate the sight of the box. As soon as they see the test box coming out, they run. So we used to test them at night. You know, so there's a limited amount of time and effort you can put into these things, and levels of participation. They don't last forever. So the key part is to make the task manageable. If you make the task manageable, what I mean by that is you use your other restriction measures so that you can target that testing capacity towards essential workers. You know, I know Sam, for example, they've got a lot of testing capacity targeted at their students because they're going back into healthcare settings. So, you know, for a limited amount of time, and for, you know, where you're using other measures to make your testing challenges manageable, I think then serial testing and whole population testing have a role to play. But I think we need to be realistic about what we can ask from, you know, from testing. It's never going to be a substitute for all the other things unless we use it in very intelligent ways to get to sustainable endpoints.
My view on that is that if we had back a situation where we were in June with 2 to 5 cases a day, and we're able to put pop-up tents where all the people in the immediate vicinity of those cases could get rapid testing, then it would really help to prevent further spread. But now when we've got, you know, probably thousands of cases a day in this island in total, to be frank, it's hard to, you can't test your way out of an outbreak from this situation.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so another question is, are we proposing a return to phase 1, including closure of schools and childcare facilities for longer, rather than just extending the length of time for what was already tried? We need additional measures, better, quicker, more testing, for example. And then there's added on, how does this work with the open border with Northern Ireland, which is something that a few people have asked.
I'm happy to take the Northern Ireland bit. Any policy we do needs to be coordinated, not just with Northern Ireland, but also with Britain and with Europe. So certainly we have to do this with Northern Ireland. So it's a matter of persuading and working with the folk in Northern Ireland to join us on this journey. I believe that's possible. Also the folk in Scotland and potentially even England and then other European countries. So that's absolutely a requirement, yeah. Gerry, I'll let you, do you want to talk about the schools?
Yeah, and maybe also I think just, I'm quite optimistic about the broader European picture and the broader global picture. It's easier to do these things on islands, but as we've seen in China and Australia, you know, they're not small places. They have huge land borders, and now they have internal borders, and they're winning the war. And if you speak to Niall Conroy out in Queensland, you know what he'll tell you about being able to mobilize the fire brigade to put out those sparks that drift across the border from Victoria. You know, it can be done, as long as you're not called in 100 different directions all on the same night. So I'm quite optimistic about that. I think for schools, yeah, I think keeping the schools open on a pathway to elimination is asking for trouble. And I think one of the difficult things about elimination strategies is that you really got to go for it. You know, the faster you get there, the sooner it's all over, and then life can go back to normal. But, you know, if all the little risks add up, they all take the steepness out of those decay curves, and we might need to kind of bite the bullet in the short term to give ourselves something to celebrate at Christmas.
I think it depends on how much schools cooperate with social distancing, where in primary schools we have little infants in small groups of pods and bubbles of groups from 4 and 5, which would probably work fine. But in secondary schools where you have hundreds of people between, say, 14 and 18, it may be more challenging to actually control their behaviour.
Thanks. There's somebody else who asks how this compares to the strategies in China and Australia. And I think there could be confusion about the nomenclature. Some people, suppression and elimination, I think, confuse people. But I think, so do you want to answer that with regard to China and Australia, the similarities and different?
So at the beginning, hard suppression and elimination look the same. At the beginning, it's not flattening the curve, it's actually crushing the curve, and they're part of both of that. The difference then is elimination. You want to prevent reintroduction and to get the numbers down to 0, not to 1 to 5, but to 0, so there's no ongoing transmission on our island, and then to prevent its reintroduction, which really requires some sort of quarantine and restrictions on people coming in. Perhaps we have to repackage, you know, rooms at the airport where people can stay for a few days. Maybe we need to offer them a lot of testing, as your previous questioner asked, testing at day 3, 5, 7, 10. And if they're all negative, then maybe get out a bit earlier. If they're not tested, then maybe 14 days. So that's where elimination requires that real ability to prevent it coming back in again. So it's crushing the curve, it's keeping it down, and it's preventing it coming back.
There's some, sorry, Gerry, did you want to answer there or no?
Yeah, and I'd just like to emphasize the importance of, you know, of how we work together in multilateral organizations. You know, the strength of multilateral organizations is that they bring us together in one direction. So the European Union, WHO, which I've had a lot of dealings with. And the downside is that sometimes it can take a while for multilateral initiatives to make a decision. And in reality, because they're consensus-based, they often lead from the middle. And so all multilateral organizations rely on member states or, you know, contributing scientists or whoever to lead from the front, to set an example, and then the group dynamic rallies the troops. You know, this WHO is really, what WHO does extremely well is to rally the troops to follow a lead that somebody else has established. And I don't see any reason why in the European context that shouldn't be Ireland.
So there's another question which asks, so multiple people have asked a version of this question of how have other pandemics ended? How did the Spanish flu pandemic end, and what happens in other pandemics?
So with Spanish flu, fortunately, once you get that strain, you know, many people survive, and then you do get some sort of immunity. So there is personal immunity and there is herd immunity to influenza. Now, of course, the flu then changes a little bit and then sort of comes in looking a little bit different and can trick your immune system because it's changed and it's a new pandemic. We've had lots of flu coming every year, of course, since then. The problem with this SARS-2 is that we don't know how much personal immunity exists. So just because I got antibodies against it, which I don't have, if I had antibodies against it, that doesn't mean I'm protected. Just because I've got T-cell responses doesn't mean I'm protected. And we have seen many instances of absolutely proven reinfection, including some cases that we're looking after where people are getting it a second time. So it's unclear, sadly, at this point, whether herd immunity for SARS exists. It doesn't exist confidently for other human coronaviruses that we've seen in Ireland over many years, the ones that cause common cold. It's partial and it's temporary. So unfortunately, this is not like sort of measles where you get it once and then it protects you for the rest of your life. This unfortunately is a coronavirus, and historically the other ones you lose the immunity after a while. So other pandemics like HIV, the good news is we've got really good triple therapy. And if you take your tablets, then you can live to 85 years of age. So that was small molecules, a bit like sort of remdesivir equivalent, except they're about 20,000 times more powerful than remdesivir, and you use 3 of them at the same time, and that keeps the person well. So polio, obviously we vaccinated our way out of it. Smallpox, we vaccinated our way out of it. So there's different ends to it. Malaria, as Gerry said earlier, is become endemic. It's just transmitting, you know, in still kills, you know, 400, lots of 400,000 or 500,000 kids a year. So some just become endemic and grumble away and take their toll of death and morbidity and mortality and loss of productivity for generations. So there's different answers to that question, Aoife.
Maybe I could add to that. I think, you know, on the negative side, you know, there was a question about the Spanish flu, you know, which did peter out, and that version of the flu kind of basically blended into the pre-existing gene pool for influenza viruses. But there was a pre-existing gene pool, and that road to stability involved, you know, 50 million people died, perhaps 100 million, nobody's quite sure. So, you know, that wasn't a pleasant experience. On the optimistic side, you know, malaria has been eliminated from half the planet. You know, it used to affect every single country in the world. British diplomats used to be paid danger money to go to Washington because of the malaria. And then closer to the COVID virus, you know, its other name is SARS-2. SARS-1 was eradicated. It was, and its initial spread was very similar to SARS-2. So, I mean, SARS-1 reached 29 different countries and was contained and eliminated in all of those countries within, I think, 8 months. And so it disappeared halfway into the year after it appeared. In the subsequent year, there were 4 outbreaks, 3 of which were traced to lab leakages, and 1 of which was traced to a exotic wildlife dinner where it popped out of the civets again. So, but since then in 2004, you know, SARS-1 has never been seen again. So that's a great example of the fact that, you know, these pathogens can be eliminated and even eradicated globally if you really put your head down on it. This happens all the time for Ebola. You know, and when Ebola speaks, people have to listen. You know, there's sometimes there is some hesitation on the political side, but sooner or later everybody has to respond. And so these things, they do happen. They're new for us here in Ireland. I see Sam wants to say something.
If I could come back in on the SARS-1 good news story, which is that one of the 29 countries was Ireland. And in 2003, there was 1 case of SARS-1 that flew in from Hong Kong to a hospital in the west of Ireland with symptoms. And fortunately, the good doctors and nurses realized, oh, this person's just arrived in from Hong Kong. There's a huge SARS outbreak there, and they put them in a single room, and they used all the gloves and gowns and masks in 2003. And there was no spread to anyone else, no spread to doctors, no spread to nurses, no spread to staff, and no spread to anyone else. So we in Ireland, even though we maybe don't celebrate it enough, did have a case of SARS-1 and did eliminate the control of that and control it completely. And that story, I don't know quite why it hasn't got widely out, but that's the case 17 years ago, just by way of good news.
I didn't actually know that. That's incredible. It's so infectious, the first SARS. So we've got another question here, which is, what does it take to get from where we were at the end of June to zero COVID? How much time does it take? What additional restrictions would be needed? How do we get the population to buy in? You know, do we need different testing?
I think those are great questions. I have to say, this is exactly the question. And my view is that we don't know for sure. So there's some uncertainty. I have to acknowledge that there's some gamble there. As in modeling can tell you what might happen, but there is some uncertainty. That's why it's a complex decision. So probably a few more weeks of ongoing restrictions, number one. Number two, more rapid testing, more accessible testing, and better contact tracing, either not just on a telephone from Galway or UCD, but face-to-face, in the local area, sort of in your face, pop-up tents, almost like a situation. There's been one case of SARS-2, you know, on my road in Clontarf, and there's a pop-up tent there 3 hours later, and everyone on the road is getting tested, and everyone in the shop where I go to buy my newspaper is tested. But we didn't see that in June. We didn't actually do any of that in June. Then a deep clean of all the places that I've been to get rid of it, and highlighting it in that local area, so everyone knows that, not that Sam had it because my personal healthcare is private, but they know that there is a case in that area and they need to be really super careful. So much more local restrictions in the immediate vicinity of every known case, and very accessible testing. And that's where lots of rapid testing would really, really help. Not just the first contacts, but second degree contacts, perhaps third degree contacts, until we've really be sure that we found out who did I catch it from and who are all the people I might have given it to. So fairly, I hate to say authoritarian because I really don't like that in my heart, but we really need very rigid control of those situations, if you like, where there was only 2 to 5 cases a day. We really didn't do that very well in June, sadly.
And so, yeah, what I would add to that is that, you know, at least we have the experience behind us, and we do have packages that we know work. Now, we know there's ways to improve them. There's lots of things that I would change. If I was to start on it, you know, it would use up the rest of the afternoon. Things like inclusion criteria, barriers to testing, you know, making things easier for vulnerable groups, immigrants, homeless, you know, direct provision. There's a long list of things. But I think the key thing we all need to recognize is the difference between this and SARS-1 and most other pathogens that you set out to eliminate is that SARS-2 plays a very clever game with us by being, first of all, generally mild symptoms. So, you know, if you got SARS-1, sooner or later, you're going to get very sick. Now, you might be transmitting before then. So SARS-1 also had pre-symptomatic transmission. So lots of the challenges were the same. What's different is that SARS-2 can go through its entire infection cycle inside you, and you might never know. And you might pass it on to somebody else, and they might never know. So because the symptomology is generally so mild and vague, that's what makes it very difficult to mop up, and that's what allows outbreaks to become so large. And that's what makes it the difference between this and SARS-1, which disappeared so fast. So we do need to learn some new tricks, but it can be done. You know, something I'm working on at the moment is the maths to figure out all that, where those thresholds are. And most of the world's surveillance systems are picking up about 10 to 20% of cases. If we can get up to 30% or 40% of infections being detected by surveillance systems, even just in a targeted manner, you know, just so you say, okay, we have an outbreak here in Waterford. Everybody needs to be on heightened alert. You know, you've got a sniffle, get tested. You've got a stomach cramp, get tested. Rash, diarrhea, whatever it is, you might think you've got a hangover, whatever it is, you get tested. And then we snuff these things out. And so We don't need perfect systems. We just need them to be better than they are because of the unique challenge presented by this virus.
Thank you. So the next question is more of an economics one. So it may be that Sam and Gerry don't feel it's their wheelhouse, but this question is: pursuit of a zero COVID or near zero status will have differential impacts on different sectors of the economy. And have many or any cost benefit economic analyses been done, in brackets accepted by government or NPHET, which is a difficult qualifier. You know, do we know what the impact of pursuit of a zero COVID will have, and would this inform what temporary support measures might be needed to be put in place?
So unfortunately, the business profile now is characterized by a lot of uncertainty. So it's difficult to estimate how much, you know, the market for beef or computer chips from Intel will be impacted in 6 months or a year's time. So I think that modeling and prediction in the traditional cost benefit analysis is quite difficult given the amount of uncertainty. So that's really all I would say there.
I would say that I think it's basically, it's difficult or impossible for a living with the virus plan that puts you through these yo-yo restrictions. I think it's easier if you have reasonable timeframes on an elimination plan, and you can address the key word that is, you know, the Achilles heel on both the economic side and on the health side, and that's vulnerability. You know, so if you have a plan and you know how long roughly it's going to take, then you can intervene to take away all those vulnerabilities. You know, look after those businesses, you know, prevent the liquidations, prevent the bankruptcies, you know, make sure that the banks you know, allow people delays on their mortgages, all those kind of things. And we need that economically. We also need it on the health side. COVID loves to hide in vulnerable populations. It loves people that are under pressure to go to work when they know they're sick. It loves the neglected. It loves people who don't speak, you know, first language English. It loves all those vulnerabilities, and it's just one more good reminder for us to address those vulnerabilities and to make sure that people can afford to do the right thing on the health side.
Yeah, if I could just maybe add to that, because of the vulnerabilities that Ger has highlighted, that's why a very laissez-faire kind of every person for themselves approach this, let's all cope individually, won't really work, because those who are most at risk don't have the capacity, ability, access to healthcare to do that. So this really requires, if it's to be effective, it requires an effective public government intervention to actually lead that in a way that's accessible to everyone, to get tested, to be able to have security of income if you don't go to work because you're sick. So my view is that we do need a state now that's a leader. We need leaders in this trial of COVID-19. It's the leaders of society that are really being challenged to step up and lead, and just letting sort of laissez-faire, let every family and community and individual do their own bit won't work, because there'll be very, very vulnerable ones that aren't able to cope, and they will not be able to control it well, whereas very wealthy areas perhaps can, but unless we all help each other, then we won't be able to achieve a national agenda that's good for all of us.
Okay, we have two questions here that are similar, so I'm going to put them together. So one is asking if the public view seems to be effectively just wait for a vaccine and everything will be okay. What do you think of that? And the other one is asking, supposing a zero COVID strategy is not chosen and we continue back and forth between lockdown and opening up, how long will this go on before we get back to something that looks like normal life?
So I'll talk about the vaccine one because I did lots of vaccine stuff. So as Ger said, we can't be 100% sure that a vaccine will come. Now, except that there's been a bigger effort to get a vaccine than we've ever tried before. But for things like HIV and malaria and many other vaccines against cancer, for example, we haven't been able to get an effective vaccine, particularly for a virus where similar viruses like coronaviruses, we don't have natural sterilizing immunity. Whereas in other things, maybe where there is a vaccine like hepatitis B, once you get it once, that does sort of protect you. So the problem with waiting for a vaccine is that you might never get a good one. Then it might be inaccessible to 8 billion people quickly. Then it might be partially effective, like 50% effective. Then it might only last for 3 or 6 months. And those are all really real obstacles. I don't think it will be dangerous. Most of the vaccine platforms are relatively safe. So I'm not worried about it being dangerous. I'm just worried not being effective. how long will this yo-yo go on? That is a huge problem. And it's that uncertainty that mainly puts me in this zero COVID commitment meeting, because that up and down and up and down, we're now in the second wave. If we suppress it and just don't get rid of it, it'll be up to a third wave. That could go on for many years. So that's a very bad for business. That's 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 years of this up and down of restrictions and illness for many years is a disaster for all of our social life and business life. And that's, to me, one of the most cohesive arguments why we have to really do our absolute utmost to aim to control it, because the alternative is much worse.
And I think I'll add to that. I think my concern is that it will go on with the yo-yo until we run out of gas. And I think we're already seeing the first signs of civil unrest. We're starting to see protests. It was one of my original concerns at the outset of the pandemic. And I think what will happen is we'll just run out of gas and it'll cut loose, because otherwise it does take years. The United States would have everybody queued up for 4 years to take their turn in ICUs. Now, I just don't see us maintaining that. We already have problems with societal fragmentation, and that one really worries me. If we don't give people some light at the end of the tunnel and something to invest in, who's going to invest into, repeated lockdowns over many, many years? Not many people. So people are understandably frustrated and disillusioned, and sometimes we see that on our TV screens at night in the form of protests and mass parties and stuff like that. We need a plan that people can buy into with a little bit of optimism, because otherwise, if you end up with a fragmented society like we've seen in the United States and Brazil, then you're really in trouble. And I pray that we don't find ourselves on that path.
Okay, so here's a question which says, NPHET are recommending nationwide level 5 restrictions. Would the healthcare system and the economy be better served by using county-specific restrictions? Let each county get their house in order, empowering local elected officials to lead the fight against SARS-2 locally, with the net result being national level 1/near zero COVID. And there might be more buy-in from the public with this kind of approach.
I think that's a great question, and many of us have advocated for differential restrictions locally. The problem is that when I'm looking at the data for the last 2 weeks for the outside of Dublin, many counties are all showing rising rates of COVID. So we're unfortunately all getting worse. It's not just Donegal and Monaghan, all the others are mostly going up as well. Also, places like Leitrim, Monaghan and Donegal, we maybe don't have the decision-making capacity to make good decisions at county level for what sort of level people should go for. So I do think we need a national, we're only 5 million people, it's a tiny number, on the world scale of 8 billion. So I think we do need national guidance on this. I think once we get down to low levels, especially zero, so let's say a county like Sligo and Mayo and Roscommon have no cases for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, then they certainly could open up much earlier than other counties. Opening up meaning not people like me going in and out from Dublin, but the domestic sports and businesses within Sligo and Mayo could open up to the people there safely way before the other counties where there's still ongoing transmission.
Great. Gerry, do you want to say something? Yeah.
I just think we need to change our mindset to, every really good public health field person has a sort of a very energetic, proactive hunter's mentality, and they go after things. We're starting to see that now that our public health teams are speaking in public. We're starting to see them, HSE Midlands, HSE West, and we get to see these disease detectives in action. And I think that's something we need to buy into as a national sport. And so I would reimpose restrictions nationally, but where I would bring in the county level is on the relaxation side and treat it as a reward rather than a punishment. We have an All Ireland to see which counties come out of lockdown first, which get to zero first. Then it's just a much more constructive way to look at it. And there's things to get excited about. So, I think we've got to take the fight to the virus and, promise ourselves what we're all going to do when it's all over. I think that's an absolutely vital part of our national outlook going ahead.
And as I understand it, part of the success in New Zealand was that they were giving lots of local data, so people could track their local situation, and you could even take pride or concern as necessary in the local situation and act accordingly. So that'd be good here as well. So there's another question: when the R number is well down, what are the actual practical steps to achieve elimination? And this person says they're never clear when this is being promoted, if it's just a slogan.
So the R number less than 1 is a little bit like negative interest rates. It's having your money in the bank where they sort of take 1% of it away each year. And you realize that takes an awful long time for your money to disappear completely. So you really need about 50% of it going away every week. So if your R number is down at 0.5, then it's dropping. The problem is it still takes quite a long time to get down to 0. There's a big difference in this between having 1 to 5 cases in a region where there's still ongoing transmission, then by definition, versus 0. So in my view, we have to really improve our testing, contact tracing, focus on local outbreaks enough so that when we get down to very few cases, we're able to get to this magic 0 and keep it there.
Okay,
I would emphasize I would emphasize patience. You know, Sam has explained this a few times on the media that, you know, it takes a long time to get rid of those last few cases, and that can be very frustrating. You know, so, you know, the patience is an important ingredient, and really kind of getting the things into place so that we don't have too many reintroductions. Yeah. Those are critical.
So it can take more weeks than people think, because there are asymptomatic people with SARS-2 out there with no symptoms. Then they could infect somebody else who's also by chance asymptomatic, and then it's not obvious that that person has got it, and that can restart another outbreak. So that takes time, and it takes, as a previous questioner asked, just lots and lots of testing.
Okay, great. So there's another question here. So this person is saying something that the Irish Independent are reporting that the government have rejected NPHET's advice to proceed to level 5 and instead will place the entire country on a level 3 footing. And what are the panel's thoughts on this? So I haven't seen this news. I presume it's accurate.
I mean, unfortunately, I think that will not bring the R number less than 1, that we'll still have similar numbers of cases with just a slower rate of increase. And then after a number of weeks more, we'll end up escalating the level. So I think the outcome will be the same, but just slower.
Agreed. And I'm kind of disappointed.
There's a couple of questions on that regard. And so there's another person asking, how long would it take from now to eliminate the virus, get down to 0? And would it be worth it, given that it could potentially return in small waves?
Well, we would have to put in place the capacity that if it does return in small waves, that we keep those really tiny. So that ability to detect every outbreak and control it is an essential attribute of a system that keeps to 0 COVID. The modeling suggests that we could get it down by sort of late December, January, depending on how strict our restrictions were. So the answer to that question of how long depends very much on how restricted we are. But we already had restrictions, what we called, I suppose, phase 0, if you like, back on the 26th of March. And we all were in those situations until mid-May, and they brought the number of cases, you know, down to 2 to 5. If that wasn't long enough, we probably needed a few more weeks. Was it 2 more weeks, 4 more weeks? That depends on the ability for mass testing, accessibility of testing, and these other factors that we've talked about earlier.
Okay, so there's a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Aoife. Yep.
Sorry, Gerry. There's a question here about nursing homes and people with disabilities and services they require. And so how are the organizations such as nursing homes and services for people with disabilities correctly supported to make the right decisions for those in their care? There's no question that a different position is being taken by different organizations. Some people are not seeing their families. Some nursing homes only allow 1 visitor. And the human suffering could be improved if services understood how to ensure safe visiting and were not allowed just to make their own arbitrary decisions. The virus may not kill them, but being alone without family or friends may make them feel they are already dead. And I know of a person with disability being sedated because they can't be taken for a walk. So very sad case.
Yeah, this isolation of sick and vulnerable people is to me one of the saddest bits that I've had to deal with when you have people who are actually dying of COVID and they had to be alone because of it. We tried to put on the full PPE and let them in. The problem is that visiting, whether it's staff members going in to work in the nursing home to care for people or care for the vulnerable, or family members going in, that brings in some risk of introducing the virus, not just to that individual, but to others in the nursing home. So you'd have to wear PPE, and that involves some teaching and training and supervision. And we have done that, let's say, in the hospitals for compassionate visits for the dying. That's a lot of PPE, a lot of training, and it creates a very artificial situation. So my view is go for zero COVID for 3 or 4 months, get rid of the thing, and then we can all go back into the nursing homes after that without any restrictions.
For me, I think this plan reflects a lot of value systems that I'll tell you openly I don't share. Keeping pubs open while we can't go to visit our, my dad, our loved ones, we're asking people to live very restricted lives. I don't share that value system. That's one of the things I think we need to rescue as part of an elimination plan, which is our humanity. I think looking specifically at the nursing homes, there's really an issue there, which is that nursing homes are heavily reliant on staff from non-EU countries who are highly vulnerable. They're very dependent on their employers and the HSE for residence permits and all that kind of stuff. I've spoken on, many people phone me up and have a chat and explain their situation. And I've had quite a few calls from people who work in nursing homes, and they explain that for many of the staff from other parts of the world, they are grossly uncomfortable with the risks that they're taking, with their residents. They don't like having to go into work when they think, they might be symptomatic. They have all these reservations. They care deeply about the residents, but they can't speak up, and they're in a particularly vulnerable position. I think also some of the other people who would speak for our most vulnerable people are not in a position to speak. Many of them work for the HSE. Many of them, would have competing interest confidentiality agreements and all that kind of stuff. So I'd just really like to hear, I'd like to hear more from long COVID people. I'd like to hear more from the people who do work in nursing homes and you feel strongly about this. I'd like to hear more from our public health physicians, who we don't have so many of and should be valued. And I'd like to hear more from our nurses. But I'm particularly happy to see they hate the term cocooners, like Charlie Bird on TV. I think Mike Murphy had some strong words to say about the idea of being, kind of locked away again. And I'd like to hear more of those voices on the media.
Because that's essentially the people who talk about shielding. That's what they're saying. They say that other people have to shut down their lives entirely and indefinitely. And of course, they don't mention that it's not only the elderly people, it's some young people who are vulnerable as well. Those young people live with families who presumably then have to cocoon in order to make the cocoon effective. So it's a totally implausible strategy. I have a couple of comments that I'll just read out and then a couple of questions. So one comment, we have solid examples of New Zealand, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, etc., that have all crushed COVID. All the data is there for the studying and adopting, isn't it? Somebody else who said they got their whole family tested in Derry yesterday at a drive-in self-test after getting NHS advice. 4 negative test results texted to us by 6:30 a.m. this morning, enabling me and my husband to go to work, my eldest child to go to school. Rapid testing turnarounds are such a game changer. And then there's somebody who asks about this group's ISAG. We plans to progress zero COVID, and who are we and how many are we? So we have a website that launched today and it's isagcovid19.org. You can look at that. Somebody's asking about infections and protecting themselves. So somebody's asking if you can get infected via a small dose or a large dose, and also asking if antiviral sprays are useful at all. I don't know if the medics have a view on that.
Yes, the small dose, there's a very clear case in Germany of a lady who visited a factory car place and touched a salt cellar in the cafeteria, which then somebody else came in and touched the same salt cellar who was not in the same room as that individual, and caught it from touching the hard surface of the salt cellar. And the Germans were able to do this detect work and found out that was a rate of transmission. So it's clear that it does survive for a period of time, not days, but for a few hours certainly, on things like a hard surface salt cellar. And then unfortunately, because we all touch our nose and mouth and eyes, we inoculate ourselves with those. So it seems like a small dose is enough. Does the dose affect how severe you get? Possibly, but I don't really know that for sure yet, that the people who get sort of a big dose of measles get much more serious measles than the people who get a small dose. That's likely to be the case, but I haven't actually seen the evidence for that. Why some people get worse and some people less, it could be some pre-existing immunity to other coronaviruses, it could be our genetic makeup, or it could be random factors. So we don't know why some people get so sick and some less so.
Okay, so one person has said it could be said that the fear is that the zero COVID approach will be too long and severe. And how do we address those concerns?
I would say it will almost certainly be shorter by far than the yo-yo approach of ongoing restrictions. So when no matter how you look at it, the zero COVID will be a lot shorter than this idea of just going through ongoing restrictions and living with it. So I would say that's the benefit of it, is that it's shorter.
And I'd just like to say I'm encouraged, looking closely at the data from our prior experience. There was no change in trajectory when we shifted from phase 0 to phase 1. And I just wish we hadn't concertinaed the 5-phase reopening plan. 3 weeks is too short a period to really see a trend. You can't take somebody down to the beach, ask them to look at the ocean and tell me whether the tide is coming in or going out. You've got to watch it for a while. You've got to allow for all the noise of the waves coming in and out. And the same is true. And then you've also got human beings involved. So sometimes it takes us a while to readjust our behavior. So we really plowed ourselves much too fast through that whole set of phases. When the 5 phases were announced, I was very clear with every press member who had listened to me that I said the wheels will squeak in phase 2 and in phase 1 and 2. They'll wobble in phase 3 and they'll fall off in phase 4 and 5. Now, we never got to phase 4. So a lot of that was very predictable. And I just wish we knew more about phase 2. But my best guess is that a hybrid between phase 1 and phase 2 would work quite well. The thing I like and different people have different ideas about how to do this. You could do it at sub-county level. And I think I really welcome the very public sharing of sub-county level data. But certainly the phase 2 model for travel restrictions, where we were all allowed to move around in our counties, but we were also allowed to cross the boundaries within 20 kilometers. That's a model that works, that I think we all found didn't kill us. It allowed people split across county boundaries. Many towns have a river going through it. It gave a fuzzy edge to the boundaries in a very similar way to the way Australia handles it. So, on the boundary between Victoria and Queensland, many people have exemptions and are allowed to cross. Many people have their house on one side of the boundary and their business on the other side. Many people are essential workers. And so that's all allowed, it's all regulated, and it would also help us deal with the border with Northern Ireland without turning it into a political issue. So, people from Donegal can go to Derry, people from Derry can go to Donegal. But if a plane load of stagniters flew in from Manchester and decided that the Guinness in Belfast was good, but they'd like to try the stuff in Dublin, then they wouldn't get past Louth. Similarly, the plane load of Texans flying into Shannon who wanted to see the Giant's Causeway, they wouldn't get very far past Limerick. So, and then as long as we have a harmonized county-based system that we share with the north of Ireland, that really takes care of a lot of issues. And so I think an awful lot of the solutions, we already have them up our sleeve. And so I just get excited about the opportunities to improve on that. And based on what we know, I'd say we could be at zero COVID by January, February, if we made the right decisions today. Unfortunately, I'm very disappointed by what I've just been told. And I think that just kicks the can down the road and isn't doing anybody any favors.
Yeah, it does seem like a delaying tactic. There's a question here asking about the group, ISAG, Independent Scientific Advocacy Group. I don't know why I stumbled over that word. And asking, here we're doing information sharing today, and what else would we be doing? Do we have any other aims? I don't know if either of you want to answer that, or somebody, members from the group want to answer that. Essentially, I mean, none of us has decision-making powers. So I think the best characterization of this group is it's a group of volunteers who are interested in this problem in an altruistic sense, and we're just trying to lend our voices and try and persuade and listen. So I think there's more information on the website regarding the aims of the group as well. The website just launched today. One question asking, what role do you see that GPs could have? I'm one, and I think we could effectively support contact tracing when numbers are low.
Agreed. Sam, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm getting bloody texts and getting distracted. I apologize for that. So I'm sorry, I missed it.
Well, I'll maybe respond then. So yeah, I've done a lot of work with decentralized surveillance, and that's the way to go, particularly when we have scalable point of care tests. The tests themselves don't need to be perfect. What's very important is that you can do them right on your desk or in your house or wherever it is that you do it. And GPs, pop-up centers, community nurses. In Africa, we use a lot of community health workers, which is basically somebody with the equivalent of junior cert education and a certificate in how to deal with basic things, who would knock on your door and give you a test. Obviously it's got to be a little bit different with something as infectious as COVID, but GPs and decentralized services, this is the way that surveillance needs to go. And experience from other diseases shows that the more that the surveillance reaches out to the people, the more people reach out and grab it with both hands. The bigger the barriers and the more centralized it is, the more you miss, and the bigger those outbreaks are going to get before you finally recognize them, and then have to load up the fire brigade and head out with the hose pipe.
I was in a webinar with the Chief Nursing Officer of Australia, who was saying that they've relied heavily on young Irish nurses who are backpacking in Australia. They've offered them temporary jobs to go around the areas of Melbourne and Victoria where there's a lot of COVID, and with PPE on, do the contact tracing and set up pop-up testing centres there and then. So I think having large numbers of trained mobile contact tracers who can go to where the cases are and also do swabbing and do information, do education, gather data about whether people are in the right place or not, and give advice, answer questions on the ground where people have the questions about what restrictions. Is it 10 days? Is it 12 days? If their test is negative, are they able to come out of restrictions? And the answer is, if you're a close contact, no, you should stay in restricted movement, even if your test is negative, especially in the early stages. So I think we need teams of these local contact tracers who would also do testing.
And I think one of the key things about point of care tests is you can test yourself, and that takes a lot of the risks out of centralizing those things, or so. And I do remember, it reminds me of, I think during the final stages of malaria elimination in Italy, they relied heavily on the postal service. So everybody would receive their chloroquine in the post once a week. And there's no reason that couldn't be test kits for people in at-risk areas where outbreaks have been identified. So there's lots of opportunities if we use modern technology and a bit of creativity. And what's a point of care test? For those of you who aren't familiar, it's basically, it looks just like a pregnancy test, except you might be using saliva.
Okay, so I think possibly the last question here is just asking about sports training and outdoor sports training for non-contact sports. Is that something that you would say is not advisable or not advisable just for vulnerable people, or do you have a view on that?
The problem is, of course, what is euphemistically known as the 19th hole. And it's not what you do on the golf course that really matters. It's what people do before and afterward. Also things like toilets and changing rooms. So when people are congregating before and after the training, that's an issue. But in theory, people outside doing, you know, tennis or sailing, relatively safe if you're outdoors and not touching each other and bringing your own racket. I think that's allowed in level 4, but not in level 5 is how it fits with our restrictions at present.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can't believe I'm back in Ireland after 24 years, and I'm, of all things, I'm saying, please don't play rugby.
Goes against the grain. Anyway, I think that's it for the questions, and we've been an hour and a half actually, so that's been really good, and that was a really great question and answer section. So thank you very much to Gerry Killeen and Sam McConkey, because you've given a lot of your time. I know you're both extremely busy, and it's been really, really informative and really, really interesting. And I think events like this where people can ask questions are really important, because we do try to anticipate people's questions, but it's important to hear from people directly, to hear what they are concerned about and what they're wondering. So just to wrap up then, we just say, so today we launched our website, which is isagcovid19.org, and the Independent Scientific Advocacy Group for COVID-19 is this group that's urging the Irish and Northern Irish governments to adopt this strategy to eliminate the virus. And you can see more information on our website. And we hope to hold more of these events, and these will be publicized in the same way as this one was. So we'll try to make sure that everybody who's interested knows about them. So we had a limit on 100 in the room for Zoom, and we were at 100 nearly the whole time. Nearly stopped Sam getting in. The fact that there were so many, and that was my concern at the beginning. I was trying to boot people out to get Sam in. Sorry about that. But so thank you very much to everybody for participating. It's a really, really important discussion to be having. As Sam and Gerry have said before, it's possibly the most important public crisis of our lifetimes, of any respect, of any kind. And how we respond to this is going to be very important, and it's going to set the stage. It's going to determine our futures for the immediate and slightly longer future, how we react now to this, I think. So it's very important that we collect all the information and we make sure to get it right. So thank you to everybody, especially to Gerry and Sam, and I hope you found it informative, and I hope we'll see you again at another one of these meetings. Thank you. And I'll just end the meeting, making sure I'm saving everything.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody take care.
Thanks.